Hi, I'm Wendy Ellsworth. I'm a seed bead artist living in the mountains of Western North Carolina with my husband, David Ellsworth, a master woodturner, and our little terrier named Max. I began beading in 1970, which is 52 years ago already. I don't know how time has gone by so fast. I'd like to thank Sam Norgard and Norgard Designs Lecture Series and the Beadworkers Guild for inviting me to give this presentation during International Bead Week 2022. I'm very honored to be a guest lecturer for this year's series with a focus on process and inspiration. So let's jump in. The title of my lecture is Catching the Light, Process and Inspiration Through Beaded Mandalas. Catching the light, what do I mean by this title? Without an object to reflect off of, light is darkness. Light is both a wave and a particle. Einstein knew this intuitively, but could not mathematically prove it. No one knows the true nature of or source of light. It's a mystery. And beads are a marvelous way to catch the light, as it's broken down into different wavelengths in order for us to perceive all the colors of the rainbow. Process and inspiration. Let's look at what these two words mean. Process, a series or set of activities that interact to produce a result. I'll explain the process I have used in a few of the different series I have created throughout my career in beadwork. Inspiration. The word comes from Latin for spiritus, meaning breath, and spirare, to breathe. Inspiration means to breathe inwardly. The first breath of life is always an in-breath. Inspiration is the process of being stimulated to do or feel something, especially something creative, new ideas and creative enthusiasm. A sudden intake of new images, patterns, and connections, taking an in-breath or breathing in a creative process. I'll show how my main inspiration in my beadwork comes from the natural world that I see all around me. I believe that beading is a process through which we can bring conscious awareness to our artwork in order to replace our fragmented self with wholeness in body, mind, and spirit. Beaded mandalas. What is a mandala? In ancient Sanskrit, mandala means circle, center, or circumference. According to Joseph Campbell, making a mandala is a discipline for pulling scattered aspects of our lives together, for finding a center and ordering ourselves to it. Carl Jung said making mandalas is a process that can bring us back into wholeness and unity with the self. In Tibetan Buddhism, a mandala is an integrated structure organized around a unifying center. Here's a quote from my book. Beading mandalas is a centering process of reconnecting with my internal center and a means of creating order out of chaos. It's the major process that I have been exploring through my beadwork for 52 years. Creating mandalas or circular beadwork in 2D and 3D is what has inspired me the most. Let's look at a few examples of other kinds of mandalas. Here we see labyrinths that have been constructed with the purpose of someone walking into and out of it as a process of consciously centering oneself, or perhaps meditating on existential questions they may have. The labyrinth on the left is an ancient one constructed on the land in Scotland. The one on the right is inside the cathedral at Chartres, France. This is an example of a stained glass rose window found in a Gothic cathedral, which is considered a mandala for people to be inspired by through observation from a distance. Here's an example of a Tibetan sand mandala constructed entirely of colored sand by Buddhist monks. Okay, so where did I begin to bead? After graduating from the University of Colorado in 1970, this is the old miner's cabin in the Rocky Mountains where I began living. It's located at almost 11,000 feet. And when I lived there, I had a 2-mile, 2,000-foot climb on skis to access it in the wintertime. No running water or electricity. It's where I moved shortly after graduation and began asking existential questions such as, who am I? What is my purpose? And what is the meaning of life? The Vietnam War was raging and my friends were coming back in body bags. The war had a profound effect on me during my years at CU, and somehow I knew that I needed to stick my head in the clouds and drop out for a while. This is where I began beading circular mandalas that went on the front of fringed leather purses that I also learned to make. I would take the completed purses into Aspen and sell them at a shop called the Gypsy Woman for about $35 to $50. I'd never taken an art class in college or high school. I'd never really made anything with my hands before. And coming from an affluent childhood, living in this cabin was an enormous pivot for me and one that would reset the course of my life. This is the first purse I made. Of course, I made it for my mom, so I still have it. I didn't photograph any of the purses I made during my year in the mountain, or pretty much for the first 10 years for that matter. So the only reason I have 2 from this period is because I made them for family members. This image shows the process I use for making beaded mandalas. Leather stretched drum type over an embroidery hoop. I begin with 1, 2, or 3 beads in the center, then circle them with an inner circle using a back stitch to attach them to each other and the piece of leather. Around the circle, I add beads in a fan-like pattern before circling them with another row of beads. This process continues until I have the diameter of the mandala I want. I use colors intuitively, one color becoming the background, a second color or colors becoming the pattern, with yet another color being used to set a boundary for each fan-shaped row. This is a camera bag I made for my younger sister also in 1970. It's approximately 10.5 inches wide by 11.5 inches high with a 4-inch wide gusset. Once the mandala was completed, it was cut in a circle, holes were punched, and it was then laced to the front of the bag with laces I cut by hand. Each purse was laced together using handheld lacing, and some kind of a button was used for a closure. This is a purse from around 1975. Notice the beaded tassels and peyote stitch, which I taught myself from reading illustrated books on American Indian beadwork. Here's a close-up of the beadwork. This mandala was beaded on a piece of felt instead of leather before it was beaded onto the surface of the purse, not laced. You can see that I have also beaded directly onto the leather surrounding the mandala for added decoration and embellishment. This is a purse I made for a good friend in about 1983. The beaded mandala is copied from a photograph of an ancient Aztec shield. You'll see the beadwork repurposed in a later image after my friend completely wore out the leather, but the beadwork was still intact. And you might notice that the lacing on this purse was a lot more advanced than that first purse that I showed you. This is an evening purse I made for my mom. The beaded mandala has been beaded onto the surface of the purse, and the whole purse was beaded together instead of being laced. The edges are completely beaded together using a wrapping technique that I developed. This is a close-up of a mandala of a phoenix made for a purse that I made for myself in 1985. I used the back stitch to attach the beads to the piece of leather and used white beads as background to create the circle format of the mandala shape. I call this my personal mandala. Intended to be a mandala of personal expression, it's like a personal shield that represents my inner spiritual core. It's 10 inches in diameter and has images that have deep symbolic meaning for me. Here the mandala has been left on the embroidery hoop, which has become the frame for the piece. Notice the phoenix representation again. I was starting to create more of a 3D effect when I beaded the amethyst beads over top of the bottom of the pyramid shape. It was made in 1989. In 1989, I noticed a stick on the ground while walking in our woods in Pennsylvania, and when I picked it up, it spoke to me and said, "Bead me." I thought that was quite funny, so I brought it into my studio and eventually decided to bead around the surface of the branch using peyote stitch. Titled Psyche, it's 17 inches tall. This was the first in my stick figure series that to date has been the most emotional work that I have created. I consider this stick figure series also a version of mandalas in the round, as tubular peyote stitch is like making a 3D mandala in the round. I'll skip to the final piece in this series as it led directly to my C-form series, which I also consider 3D mandalas. This is the final piece in my stick figure series. She's titled Goin' Dancin' and stands 17 inches high. Made in 1994, I entered her in the seed bead category at Bead and Buttons Embellishment Contest, and she won second prize. Notice the green ruffled skirt I peyote beaded in the round on her. The skirt began to ruffle when I started increasing the number of beads in a row, then placed more increases in subsequent rows. This process is similar to making ruffles in crochet with yarn. Why not try it using beads? This led directly to both my basket and C-form series when I realized that the stick figures were extremely fragile, thus very breakable. And I wanted to start making 3D beadwork without an armature to bead around that would be freestanding. So I taught myself how to do flat circular peyote stitch, which you can see in the bottom of the bear totem basket on the right side of this image. The red beads you see in the base represent a W for my first initial. I began flat circular peyote with 3 beads in the center. I would place gradual 2 bead increases in order to keep the base flat. And when I got the diameter of the base that I wanted, I stopped increasing the number of beads in the circle, tightened the tension on the thread in order for the walls of the basket to go upward. In many of the small baskets I started making, I used imagery from the southwest of the US, as in this bear totem basket. I would graph the design before I began beading. It's made with single bead peyote stitch, except for the gradual increases in the base. The top edging of the basket is a simple 5 bead picot placed in each stitch. It's 3 inches high with a 2.5 inch diameter. By 1995, I was starting to experiment with ruffling within the small baskets or vessel shapes I was making, as well as the upper section of the baskets. You can see the development of undulating curvature both in the body of the basket shown here, as well as along the upper edge of this piece, which is titled simply Undulating Red Vessel. This next image shows one of my early C-forms as I was continuing to experiment with what I called ruffling. I began each C-form with 3 beads in the center of the bottom, as you can see if you look carefully at the image on the left side of the screen. The image on the right shows the top side of this little C-form and the undulation of the ruffle that I achieved through radically increasing the number of beads in each row. The process I use for radically increasing involves placing 2 beads instead of a single bead in a stitch as I bead around the row I am working on. I'll do this about every 3rd stitch. Then in the subsequent row, I'll place a single bead in the middle of the 2 bead increase stitch of the row before, as well as a 2 bead increase in between the increases from the row before. If I keep increasing the number of beads in the rows, the form I am making will begin to undulate and ruffle. I was just experimenting with what would happen when I made the increases, how often to make them each row, and how many rows to keep increasing in order to get the beadwork to ruffle. It was a natural process of exploration I was going through. There were no books to show me how to do this. All of this led directly into what I now refer to as my C-form series, which I'm still exploring today. And in my mind, I view each C-form as a 3D mandala. In 2000, a project I designed to teach people how I was making ruffles using what I termed radical increasing in peyote stitch made the cover of Bead and Button magazine. If you look at the image on the right side, you'll see this technique diagrammed. For the ruffled cabochon brooch project, I showed how to put a 2 bead increase in every stitch around a row of peyote. In the subsequent row, I placed a single bead in the center of every 2-bead increase. You can see that in figure number 2. Let's see. A single bead in the center of every 2-bead increase of the row before, as well as a 2-bead increase in between those single bead stitches. Then by the third row, which you can see in figure 3, as the peyote was ruffling, I placed a single bead in each stitch. This will give you an understanding of what I'm referring to when I use the term radical increasing in peyote stitch. I consider this the first piece in my C-form series. Its title is simply Blue Wave C-form. It was made in 1995 and is 2.5 inches high by 4.5 inches wide by 5 inches in length. It has 4 layers. The process I came up with to make this piece involved beading a bottom layer by beginning in the center with 3 beads and working my way outward with flat circular peyote. I made a slight ruffle in this bottom layer through radical increases in a final row with a 3-bead picot edging. Then, starting underneath the bottom edge of the first layer, approximately 10 rows from the outer edge, I began a second layer by stitching through each bead and adding a new bead on top of the row I was beading into, or I should say underneath it. I worked this layer out approximately 20 rows, adding radical increases to make it start to gently ruffle and ending that layer with another picot edging of 3 beads. Again, I came underneath the bottom side of the second layer and started a new row of peyote stitch, approximately 10 rows from the outer edge, built this third layer out about a dozen rows, adding radical increases to increase the ruffling and a final picot edging. And I used the same process for the fourth layer, adding a total of approximately 20 rows and adding those radical increases to keep it ruffling. And then in the final row, I did a 3-bead picot, and then I stitched back through the center bead of each one of those 3-bead picots and did a 5-bead picot for the final row. I was now making 3D mandala sculptural beaded forms whose purpose was just for everyone's observation and enjoyment. This is another very early piece in my C-form series, made the same way as the one I just described before, titled simply Green Wave C-form. It's 2 3/4 inches high by 4 3/4 inches wide and 5 inches long. Then something magical started to happen in my exploration with ruffling. As I continued to make more and more radical increases as I worked the rows and layers of the C-forms I was making, the whole form began to undulate more and more until I began creating forms like this one, titled Montserrat after the Caribbean island. It was made in 1996. It stands 4 inches high by 5 inches in diameter. I showed several of my C-forms to a marine biologist about this time, who informed me that I had invented an entirely new form of aquatic life, a combination of a marine bryozoan coupled with the wild colors of nudibranchs. I was beginning to understand the process I had created to make these C-forms. Now I was looking for inspiration for the colors I was intuitively using to make the pieces. When it came time to change color in a C-form, when I would get to a different layer, I might try anywhere from 10 to 20 colors before I found the right one that felt right for that specific piece. What I've done in this presentation is look to nature for where I might have seen the color combinations I was using intuitively for this body of work. I won't comment on the inspiration images, I'll just show them to you. The title of this piece is Maui, made in 1996. It stands 3.5 inches high by 4.5 inches in diameter. When I started to sell my C-forms at craft shows, I decided that I wanted to deflect the question many people would ask me, how long did it take you to make this? So I would guesstimate how many beads were in any given C-form. I did this by weighing the piece and weighing the types of beads I used in the piece and counting how many beads were in a gram of each type of bead. So the guesstimate for Maui is 18,200 beads. Then I would explain to the person posing the question that every bead had been picked up individually and each bead had 2 passes through it, to attach it to the piece and to secure the next row. When I explained it that way, they got a sense of the time it took me to make each C-form. Regarding the real answer as to how long it actually does take me to make a C-form, it really depends on the number of layers I make in any given piece. A 4-inch diameter piece that has 4 layers can take anywhere from 60 to 70 hours. And I remember making a C-form so large and ruffled that just the final row in it took an entire day to bead. The title of this small C-form is Antigua, made in 1995. It's 3.5 inches high by 3.5 inches in diameter. I entered it in the seed bead category at Bead and Buttons Embellishment Contest in 1996. And to my surprise, it won first place. Considering how complex beadwork has gotten since 1996, I'm still surprised that something so small won first place. Please notice the base for this piece. It's a blown, etched puddle of clear glass. I decided that I wanted to place the C-forms on blown glass bases and began working with a glass blower. He made 2 main shapes for me, a puddle of glass that was immediately etched with real coral that had been cast into bronze like this one. So the imprinting you see on this base was made from real coral. In another image, you'll see the second kind of glass bases that he blew for me that I call waves. The title of this C-form is Cancun. Made in 1995, it's 3 3/4 inches high by 5 inches in diameter. I found working in these hot colors very stimulating, especially in winter when I was surrounded with snow and barren trees in my Pennsylvania forest. A close-up of the edge of Cancun. Perhaps you can detect the different layers of the piece and the different colors of edge beads I used, varying from green to red to yellow with black picots. When I began beading in 1970, the only beads I could buy in Colorado were made in Czechoslovakia. I would go to the trading post in Denver to buy my beads, and they were mostly opaque colors in size 11s. Eventually, as time went on, when beads began to be made in Japan, the choice of colors really exploded, and those of us beading had a much enlarged palette to choose from. I actually preferred using Czech seed beads to make my C-forms because of their irregularity. When I worked radical increases in peyote stitch, I would place 2 beads in a slot where there had only been room for 1 bead from the previous row, as you have seen. I would pick through my Czech seed beads to find the ones that were more narrow to use for the increases, as well as for the single bead I would place in the next row between the 2 bead increase of the row before. And that made for a better transition for the undulations as they were created. The title of this piece is Tanjung Sopi, made in 2011. It's 2.5 inches high by 4 inches deep in diameter. I included orange and blue glass lentil beads for contrast. I wondered where the inspiration for this color combination came from and found it in a National Geographic magazine's article on photographing coral reefs. This image shows one page in the article where the author shows what the coral reef looks like being photographed using an electric flash. Look down in the bottom right-hand corner for this. Then he went diving at night, and his partner played a powerful ultraviolet light over the same corals, and they exploded with colors that are almost unimaginable, and colors that look like what I had been using. Wow. Here's another page from the same article that shows almost the exact same color scheme of my C-form Tanjung Sopi. I was amazed at the description, which I'll read for you. Quote, illuminated by ultraviolet light, a knob coral pulsates with color as if lit from within. The coral absorbs the invisible ultraviolet light, then emits wild orange visible light. This is called fluorescence, a phenomenon of physics and biology that borders on pure magic, unquote. The title of this piece is Sanana, made in 1996. 5 inches high by 7 inches in diameter. It contains approximately 19,000 seed beads. You can see how the blown glass wave base cradles Sanana as if it was growing from its center. My work was juried into the Philadelphia Museum of Art craft show in 1996 in the glass category. I had decided to enter in the glass category because I used glass seed beads and my C forms had blown glass bases. All the known glass artists who were also doing the show came by my booth to check out the new kid on the block. And every single one of them walked over to me and told me I was nuts for doing what I was doing. No one had ever seen anything like my work. Many people who came into my booth told me that in their opinion, I had the most original work in the entire craft show, which was a huge compliment for me. Here's another C form titled Tanjung Sopi. It stands 7 inches high by 5 inches wide by 5 inches deep. Made in 2002, I used a variety of beads that included sizes 11 and 8 seed beads and dagger and lentil beads. I beaded it using single and 2 bead peyote stitches along with herringbone stitch. I taught myself the newest beading technique in our field called herringbone stitch, or some people call it Ndebele because it came from the Ndebele people of South Africa. And I'd mastered how to ruffle and herringbone stitch, as you can see from the yellow and orange flower. Here's a close-up of the flower that shows the ruffling and herringbone stitch I had figured out, and large dagger beads in the center of the flower, along with metallic lentil beads I used for the edging. I used branch fringing as embellishment on the tall columnar forms behind the flower. A final unique C form. I only made one like this. I think you can call this a warped mandala shape. Made in 1997, it's 5 1/4 inches high by 8.5 inches wide by 7 inches deep. The title is Tanjung Kundur. Made in single and 2 to 4 drop peyote stitch in a variety of size 11 seed beads with a raspberry fringe center. It sits down inside the entire glass wave base, with beads spreading up to the top edges and over them. I wondered for a while where the inspiration for this particular shape and form came from. Then I got another National Geographic magazine from 2003, and on the cover was a color photo showing the discovery of the first galaxies. And I wondered where my mind or soul has been journeying in my dreams, because it reminded me of Tanjung Kundur, and the way I had made it was eerily similar to the photos of these outer space galaxies that had been photographed with satellite telescopes. Now I'm going to show a series of mandalas that my wood-turning husband, David Ellsworth, and I made together as collaborative work beginning in 1992. First, I'd like to show you David's process for turning the large wooden mandala platters into which we insert my beaded mandalas. My intention is to frame the mandalas so that they can hang on the wall and become objects of contemplation. A wood lathe is like a horizontal potter's wheel. When a piece of wood is mounted on the headstock of the machine and is turned on, the wood begins to spin around. Wood turning is a subtractive process whereby the person turning takes wood away from the starting object to create a desired form, whereas beading is an additive process. In the image on the left side, David has mounted a square piece of oak onto the headstock of the lathe and is about to inscribe the diameter of the circle he wants with a gouge. The image on the right shows him next taking the piece of wood to a bandsaw and cutting around the circle he inscribed to remove it from the square format. In the image on the left, David is now spinning the wood back on the headstock of the lathe and cutting into the wood with a gouge to get the surface of it smooth. In the image on the right side, he then sands the wood with a handheld sander. The image on the left side shows how the wood is being held onto the headstock of the lathe. He uses what's called a vacuum chuck and a vacuum system that sucks the wood tightly to the chuck to hold it in place while he sands it. The image on the right shows what the mandala looks like before he cuts into it to create a recess for inserting the beaded mandala. The image on the left shows the recess he has made to receive the beadwork that would be stretched over a piece of masonite before it's inserted into the recess in the wooden mandala frame. The image on the right shows the masonite being held by a smaller vacuum truck before it's turned into a circle that matches the diameter that you can see on the left. A final image showing the masonite disc next to the recess. The leather containing the beadwork will be glued to the front of the disc and around to the back of it. Then the disc with the beadwork attached will be glued into the recess. You'll notice in the subsequent images that David has placed the recesses on the wooden platters off center. This is a personal preference of his aesthetic rather than mine. And since this is collaborative work, I've not objected, even though my original preference was to center the beadwork on the wooden platter mandalas. I've not shown the wooden mandalas having a final oil finish applied, but that will happen once the beadwork has been glued in. Here are two beaded mandalas that have been made using the process described before. Both of them were created in 1992 as part of a series we worked on together. The mandala on the left is 11 inches in diameter, made from ash from our wooded property where we were then living in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Notice the repetition of the use of white beads to create the geometric pattern within the beaded mandala and different hues of blue to offset the white beads. The wooden mandala on the right is made from maple wood, also from our property, and is 11 inches in diameter. The beadwork was primarily done in pinks, greens, and blues, an unusual palette for me to work in. This mandala was also made in 1992. It's 10.5 inches in diameter, and the base is walnut. Here I use black beads to create the design and green beads as background, with red beads to define each circle. I achieved a pinwheel effect with the placement of the beads within the design. It's not easy to have an exact number of beads for each geometric shape when you get around to that filling in that final little section. But I seem to have done an okay job here. At least I can't see anywhere where I'm off. Remember the purse I mentioned in an earlier image? This is the beadwork removed from the worn out purse and placed on a 15-inch white oak wooden mandala. Amazingly, the beadwork after almost 30 years was still in perfect condition. This was made in 2013. And the friend, I surprised her with this mandala. She just said, can you repurpose this beadwork for me? And I thought about it for a while, and I thought, well, maybe there's enough leather here that I can get it onto using the technique I mentioned, get it onto a wooden platter. And we were able to do that. And when she received it, she was very, very grateful to see it again, and it's hanging in her house. Now I want to show you a series of 3D beaded flower mandalas that we made in 2013 for a joint exhibition that David and I had at the Morris Arboretum in Pennsylvania, titled Ellsworth and Ellsworth. This mandala, just simply titled Sunflower Mandala, is 14.5 inches in diameter, made out of white oak. Here's a close-up of the beadwork that I made using size 8 and 11 seed beads, shaped glass beads, and glass flowers. I began the sunflower as usual by stretching the leather on an embroidery hoop, started beading in the center with size 8 seed beads, stitched in a spiraling pattern. What I was doing was I was picking up a size 8 seed bead and a size 11 seed bead, and then reversing back down through the size 8, leaving the size 11 sitting on top of the size 8 bead. And when you look at this photo, it's the green and brown beads you can see in the center of the sunflower that I attached that way. Then I stitched lily flower check glass beads in 2 circles around the center of the sunflower, followed by 2 rows of check-shaped petal beads. Both of those beads came from Bead Cats, which at that point in time was supporting an entire check glass making factory, if I recall correctly. Then I made the individual, what they call yellow ray flowers in size 11 delicate beads using a variation of peyote stitch. And each ray flower was stitched onto the outer perimeter of where the 2 rows of check shaped petals have been added. The beadwork is 6 inches in diameter and sticks out 1 inch from the 2D plane. And if you notice, I'm actually wearing another sunflower that I made this time in solidarity for Ukraine. And this is a pin that I can wear on anything I feel like putting it on. But it's made exactly the same way. The flower mandala on the left of this image is titled Orange Poppy Mandala. It's 6 inches in diameter and sticks out 3 inches from the 2D plane of the turned oak mandala platter, which is 15 inches in diameter. The beaded mandala on the right is titled White Lotus Mandala and is 5 inches in diameter. The lotus flower sepals stick out 2 inches from the 2D plane of the 15-inch turned white oak platter. Here's a close-up of the orange poppy mandala. I used 2-bead ladder and 2-bead brick stitches in size 8 seed beads to make the orange petals of the poppy flower, and a variety of fringing techniques stitched individually onto the leather base. In the center, you can see the melon-shaped ovaries surrounded by stamens I made using a variety of fringing techniques. This is a close-up of White Lotus Mandala. You can see the yellow carpellary receptacle structure of the lotus sticking up in the very center of the flower. The white and pink tipped sepals are made using ladder and herringbone stitch with increases and decreases to make the shape. And I just made it up. The carpellary receptacle is made with tubular peyote. I placed large yellow glass dagger beads surrounding the carpellary receptacle. A frog fetish was added for interest on top of the green beads that represent a lily pad. This is titled Purple Lotus Mandala. It's 5 inches in diameter and the sepals stick out 2 inches from the flat surface. The center of the flower is 3D fringe sticking out about 1/2 inch from the flat surface. The turned white oak wooden mandala is 14 inches in diameter. The beadwork is made using backstitch 3-bead embroidery with fringing and ladder and herringbone stitches. This is the final piece in my 3D flower mandala series to date, titled Wisteria Mandala. Made in 2015, the beaded mandala is 5 inches in diameter. Multiple tendrils hang down, approximately 7 inches, and each raceme is 2 inches in length. The beaded raceme begins with right angle weave in the center of the cluster, and then beads are added on either side of the central raw column. The leaves are made using a variation of peyote stitch. All of the pieces I've shown you in this series hung in the Philadelphia Museum of Art for an entire year as part of David's exhibition titled At the Center, Masters of American Craft, 2016 to 2017. In asking myself where the inspiration for this 3D mandala series came from, I discovered that possibly I was inspired by these fun pop-up greeting cards that when opened, a 3D image of some kind pops out. This is an example of a pop-up greeting card with a hyacinth flower that I intend to make next. A final image that shows the cover of the book I wrote that was published in 2009, titled Beading, the Creative Spirit, Finding Your Sacred Center Through the Art of Beadwork. I received a call on my 60th birthday from an editor at Skylight Paths Publishing Company, asking me if I had ever considered writing a book on beading as a meditative spiritual practice. 9 months later, I delivered the manuscript to the publisher. It's not a typical how to bead book. Rather, it's a bead that's autobiographical in scope, that shares my spiritual journey through beads and how I've used beading as a meditative spiritual practice since I began in 1970. I'd like to think that in these crazy times we're currently living in, that perhaps the book can serve to direct beaders in creating order out of chaos, as it has done for me the past 52 years, as well as helping people find a place of deep inner peace and joy within themselves. It's still available to purchase on the internet. All right, let me see how I can get out of here. That's my cursor. Let's see, let me do it this way. There we go. In conclusion, I would like to again thank Sam Norgard and the Beadworkers Guild for inviting me to give this presentation focused on process and inspiration that I chose to address through the lens of beaded mandalas that I've been making for over 52 years. I know that beading can be a balm for the soul, and I hope that you've been inspired to keep on exploring, experimenting, and enjoying the creative process through the art of beadwork. Namaste.